college was reading transcendental style in film, and it still are. But the book came on the scene in 1972, and really showing a deeper, more expansive vision of what cinema can do and is doing, and was really kind of a countercultural text. Under that spirit, we invited Paul Schrader to be our speaker to engage this audience, especially since Paul wrote a new introduction for it for last year's release from this edition from University of California Press. And he's reviewing his thoughts. Were pretty sharp when he was a younger man, and remain sharp today with some. I think we'll get a lot of that. Remain extra sharp today. And Paul was gracious just to accept the invitation, really without much conversation. So won't engage you as serious thinkers and artisan intellectuals, as Dana Joy might say, or scholar practitioners. Sounds kind of post-Reformation, but we'll go with it. But then I didn't know, but this film then he released First Reformed, and so for right? Thank you, Justina.
Yeah, actually, I was writing the script and this essay at the same time.
Oh, did you hear that? Paul was writing the script and the essay at the same time, so that's a nice glimpse into it. And just we're showing the film at 7 o'clock tonight, so if you're not going to the play, you can come and watch the film on this side of the room, and Paul will introduce it and then be there for responses afterwards. So that will be a lovely gift that Paul's doing. So we engaged him on that, and then the film came out, and really it's right up our street, as if you can see it, you know. So it was an extra providential invitation that was accepted. So that's really all I have to say for the genesis of this. Just to read, Paul Schrader is a screenwriter, director, and film critic born in Michigan. Schrader is a graduate of Calvin College and the UCLA Film Program, where he was mentored by film critic Pauline Kael. He's the author of Transcendental Style in Film, Ozu, Bresson, and Dreyer. His best-known screenplays include Raging Bull, Taxi Driver, The Last Temptation of Christ. Most recently, he both wrote and directed the critically acclaimed film First Reformed. Paul writes and directs and sometimes does both. So Paul is going to speak to us for a spell, and then we'll have a little conversation and we'll open it up to the crowd. Okay, so without further ado, let's welcome Paul.
Yeah, I was a cradle Christian, a phrase I heard today for the first time, from across the lake in western Michigan, a product of the Christian school system, Westside Christian, Grand Rapids Christian High, Calvin College, which is now, as of this year, Calvin University. So here are some thoughts I put together about when I... about when I decided to revisit this book, or this is the revisited book. 50 years ago, I graduated from Calvin in Grand Rapids and headed for UCLA Film School. The 60s had come in like a howling wind and carried me off. I transferred my interest in theological matters to a love of cinema, specifically the European cinema of the 60s. I had a lot of catching up to do. The Christian Reformed Church's position on film attendance was restrictive. And when I was raised, and I had not seen many films. So in Los Angeles, I became a movie buff and a film critic, and I saw movies constantly. But I remained curious. Was there a connection between the world I was living in and the world I had come from? In certain films, I sensed a link between my past and present, between the sacred and the profane, between the life of the soul and the commercial life of film. But it was a link of style, not content. And it was this insight that I had, an insight others have had before me. Spirituality in art is about the how, not the what. The form reveals the content. Content is crucial, of course, but content is defined by form. Just a little bit of a side, which is pretty much the opposite of everything I heard earlier today. So at the age of 24, I wrote Transcendental Style of Film. I realized I was too young at the time, but I also realized if I didn't write it then, no one ever would. I never would, rather. I didn't see anyone else writing it either, so I took the plunge. Transcendental Style I proposed in that book was informed by the films of Ozu, Bresson, and Dreyer. Their films use similar techniques to draw the viewer into contact with the ineffable, the invisible, what Rudolf Otto called the holy other, or what in Zen terminology would be Mu. These techniques were to varying degrees withholding techniques. They hold elements away from the viewer, elements the viewer expects. The viewer gets less. The essence of motion pictures is action and empathy. Photographs create empathy. You see a picture of something and you relate to it. And then the photographs move, action and empathy. These are the great engines of motion pictures, the source of their commercial appeal. In place of action, Transcendental Style offered delayed action, sometimes inaction. Characters speak slowly, walk slowly. There are lengthy tableaus where nothing seems to happen. Excessively long camera takes. Take, for example, the delayed cut. Normally, you make a cut on action. So if someone is coming in that door, the splice will be dropped as the door opens or as the door closes. And Bresson was the first director I saw violating this rule. And I saw it in Pickpocket. And he would hold out a door, and then a character would enter. Or he would take a character to a door, and they would exit, and then he would hold on the door. Now, that's not how your eye works. You don't watch a door after somebody leaves. You find something else to watch. But now you're in a darkened theater, and there's nothing else to watch. And so now you're sitting there watching that door. Well, what's happening? Well, something is happening, and it's not nothing. This type of style also retards empathy. Transcendental Style uses flat expressions, both in scenic design and in performances, often by non-actors. In conventional films, dramatic scenes are added to enhance empathy. See the dog, see the boy watching the dog, back to the dog, back to the boy. In Transcendental Style, it has longer takes and fewer cuts. No editorial winks or nudges. No one saying, this shot is more important than this shot. The viewer isn't being instructed by edits. The viewer's eye must make choices. Which of the characters on screen is more interesting at this moment? The person speaking or the person listening? The same is true with music. Underscoring is the simplest and most effective way to dictate emotion. It tells you how to feel, happy, scared, sad, and so forth. In Transcendental Style, there is often no musical underscoring, only sound effects, no musical guideposts. Or often music is used incongruently or unexpectedly. In Ozu, for example, a burst of Western romantic music over the shot of a vase or a train station. Why would filmmakers work against the very qualities that make movies unique and successful? Because such filmmakers have a different agenda. They do not seek solely to entertain, divert, and amuse. They want to draw viewers closer to the non-material world, into the mystery. To do this, Transcendental Style must take a lean-back approach. Most films lean into the viewer, desperate for the viewer's attention. The movie grabs us by the lapels and says, here's a beautiful people, and here's some fast action, and here's some music so you know how to feel all the time. You know, they're so desperate, movies are. And we are so desperate to be passive, we think this is a good movie. You know, we don't have to do anything. So contemplative films, on the other hand, have to lean away. They have to challenge the viewer to lean forward, to become part of the film's journey, to be active rather than reactive. So transcendental style doesn't rely on intellectual or emotional techniques. You can't think your way into the world of the soul, and emotions don't get you any closer. Spiritual style in art is closer to meditation, to find that quiet place where the holy resides. It is then a process, a way, you know, it is a Tao. An artist cannot bring a viewer into the presence of the mystery by catering to the viewer's wishes. It doesn't work that way. There is no such thing as fast meditation. And there is no such thing as fast transcendental style. When a film leans away from a viewer can do one of two things. He or she can lean forward into the film, or they can leave the theater. At what point is it possible for a film to lean back too much? At what point does boredom cease to be an aesthetic tool and become plain old boredom? You know, that's the delicate dance of transcendental style, what I like to call the scalpel of boredom. You know, it's a very tricky medical instrument to use. So I wrote that book. University of Cal Press published it, and my life took another direction. I became involved in screenwriting and directing. I liked spiritual films. I had written about them, but I had no interest in making one myself. I was too intoxicated by action and empathy. Occasionally, someone would attempt to connect my films with transcendental style, and I would say, no, that's not me. You'll never catch me skating on that thin Braconian ice. And so, I mean, I was, you know, sort of intoxicated by action, empathy, sex, and violence, and these are not in the transcendental toolkit. Then 3 years ago, I was invited to observe, I guess it's 4 years ago now, I was invited to observe a panel at SCMS, Society for Cinema and Media Studies, at their yearly conference, and the panel was called Rethinking Transcendental Style. 3 film scholars, one from Texas, Israel, and Spain, gave reappraisals of my 45-year-old book. And I thought to myself, if anyone is rethinking transcendental style, it should be me. So I started rethinking. And the result was an essay, which is in this new edition. And it took almost 3 years to write because I was dealing with a lot of slow cinema, and believe me, they're making slow cinema faster than we can watch it. So what did happen to transcendental style? First, Gilles Deleuze happened, then Andrei Tarkovsky happened, and then slow cinema happened. What I didn't realize in 1972 was that what I was calling transcendental style was actually an outgrowth of post-war neorealism. This was the insight that French philosopher Gilles Deleuze brought with his 2 cinema books, Movement Image in 1984 and Time Image in 1986. Obviously, these were translated and published after I had written that book. Deleuze divided film history into 2 periods. Movement image, which was defined by how objects moved on screen, and time image, which was defined by the time an object was observed. So the film began watching moving objects. For him, the demarcation was World War II. After the war, with the rise of Italian neorealism, Deleuze detected a shift away from the importance of movement toward the importance of time. Now, I'm not that well versed in Deleuze, and I'm a little over my head here. and no doubt that he's not an easy man to read. But I think it's hard to deny that beginning in the late 1940s, certain narrative images began to slow their pace, certain narrative films began to slow their pace and linger over their images. Both Andre Bazin and Deleuze point to the same shot in Vittorio De Sica's Umberto D as the beginning of this change. In that film, there's a scene where a maid, a minor character, rises from bed and goes to light the kitchen stove. In one long take, she takes a stick match and strikes it on the wall. It lights, but then goes out. She gets another stick match, lights it on the wall. This time, she holds it to the gas, turns the gas on, and the flame goes out. So uses a third match, this time lights it same place on the wall, takes it over to the gas stove, turns the gas on, and now the gas burner ignites. Now, what has happened here? De Sica is shifting the center of gravity of the scene. The scene becomes not about the movement of striking a match, but the time spent watching the striking of a match. That is a very critical distinction, and both Bazin and Deleuze spotted it in the same scene. Bresson was one of the first directors to realize that this unnecessary protraction of time, holding on to an image longer than the viewer expects, has had a phenomenological effect. The viewer becomes aware of watching something over time. This is what Henri Bergson had called la durée, the duration of an experience, and Deleuze is in that tradition. Duration changes the relationship of the seer and the seen. So let's go back to the delayed cut. So the character exits the room. And Bresson holds on the door. What's happening for those 3 seconds? It's not nothing. Something is happening. But it's not about the door. It's about the time spent watching the door. What if he holds on the door for 10 seconds? Then what's happening? Or 30 seconds? What's happening then? Duration. And because movies exist in a fixed time frame, duration becomes a much more powerful tool than any of the other arts, because you can just freeze people's rhythms. When you do it in a novel, they put it down and start up reading again. And so Bresson and Ozu and Rossellini used duration to create meditative cinema, and Mizoguchi and Antonioni used it to create contemplative cinema. Let me give you an example of how duration works. An exaggerated one. Let us imagine a pastoral scene. A grassy hill, clouds, a far-off road, a small herd of goats, all in one locked-off frame. A man appears in the upper right-hand corner, and there is a diagonal pathway down the hill, and he starts walking down the path, not too fast. Now, if you've seen any slow films, you know that director is not going to cut until that man makes the entire journey across the screen. And then, even then, he may wait until the man has exited. So, what's happening when you watch this? Well, your mind begins to wander. You look at the goats. There are 5 of them. You listen to the wind and the trees. You watch the shape of the clouds. You hear the sound of distant children. And then a school bus seems to be coming. What side of the screen will it come in? Is it coming from the right, or is it coming from the left? Oh, the bus drove away. It's not going to come in. But there are only 4 goats now. One of them must have left when I was worried about that school bus. Oh, the man's almost halfway down the hill now. but the sky seems darker. Is a storm coming? And what's that? And why is the wind so much louder? And what's that sound? Is the school bus coming back? So what's going on here? You, the viewer, are watching a movie, but you're also creating one. Your own movie about children and a school bus and goats and an impending storm. You have become an active viewer. You are leaning forward into the film, leaning into the making of the film. At the time, Gilles Deleuze was formulating his theory of time image, which is duration. Andrei Tarkovsky, the Russian director, was putting it into practice. Influenced by Bresson, Tarkovsky brought withholding devices to a large canvas, encompassing science fiction, dreams, memory, history, metaphysics, poetic realism. Ozu's theme was the family, Bresson's was the individual, Tarkovsky's theme was time itself. Although Tarkovsky used elements of transcendental style, I don't think he was a purist. He had religious themes, obsessions, characters. He was austere. He employed distancing devices, but his intent was slightly different. A transcendental guide or guru or self-effacing film director seeks to escort his respondent to another level of consciousness. Tarkovsky was more interested in passing through the portal himself than escorting the viewer. This seems clear in his 1984 film Nostalgia. At the end of the film, the character of Dominic, who's a deranged mystic, immolates himself, sets himself on fire. In response, Andrei, the film's protagonist and Tarkovsky's surrogate, fulfills a promise to carry a lit candle across the waters of a mineral pool. The pool is empty, but Andrei struggles against the wind and his failing health to complete his task. Back and forth, back and forth. Finally, he reaches his goal, places the flickering candle on a stone ledge, falls off screen, and dies. Now that shot, that candle, that is the Bressonian ending. That's the last shot of Diary of a Country Priest. It's the last shot of Trial of Joan of Arc, the smoldering stake. But it's not the last shot of Nostalgia. Tarkovsky then switches to black and white and concludes with a long pull-out of Andrei, who sits with his dog in front of his ancestral home. And as it pulls out, it is revealed to be inside of the ruins of a stone cathedral. The subject of the film isn't the candle, it isn't the icon, it is memory, and Tarkovsky's memory. Tarkovsky's films mark a dividing point in the history of durational cinema. Before Tarkovsky, the use of withholding and distancing devices, what Deleuze called time image, took place in the context of commercial theatrical cinema. Transcendental style falls in this category. After Tarkovsky, these devices became increasingly exaggerated, and they fell into the domain of film festivals and art museums. The 3-second Bresson shot of a door became a 10-minute static shot of nature. Transcendental style had morphed into that hydra-headed monster we call slow cinema. Without going into it at length, slow cinema refers to films of considerable length where very little seemingly happens. Bellatar's Satan Tango, for example, runs 7 hours long, and the opening shot is of cows wandering in a farm courtyard for 7.5 minutes. That's why it is essentially outside the purview of commercial cinema. Cinema, in my opinion, is inherently narrative. When an image occurs over time, that's narrative. When 2 images are conjoined, that's narrative. Film narrative has become more and more complex over the decades, but what happens when it becomes less complex? What happens when it dissembles? What happens when movement image becomes time image? What happens when action becomes duration? These are the questions raised by slow cinema, and it seems to me as movies move away from their narrative essence, their nucleus, they vector in one of three directions, three dead end points. One is the surveillance camera, the unending documentation of reality. Another is the art gallery. Film is pure abstraction of color and shape. And the third is the mandala, the fixed image suitable for meditation. So let's go back to the maid and Umberto D, who struck her match 3 times. In 1975, Chantal Ackerman's Jean Diedelman spent a 30-minute stretch watching its protagonist do household tasks. In 2009, the maid and Diedelman had morphed into the family members of Jean-Louis Oxide 2, who prepare and eat dumplings over the course of her 132-minute 9-shot film. Well, the next stop is the surveillance cam. And yes, you can see the surveillance cam movie, but it will be in an art gallery. In fact, you can hardly go to an art gallery without seeing a movie. So the art gallery then, what defines these vectors is their origin and movement image and their endpoint and conceptual essence. And the fact that at some point, they pass through the Tarkovsky ring. And the Tarkovsky ring is a celestial marker which separates commercial cinema from museum cinema. So in closing, I return to the question with which I began. What happened to transcendental style? It's still there. It's still being used. Transcendental style is, of course, far within the Tarkovsky ring. It's relatively close to the nucleus, in fact. The style is designed for audiences, not academics, smaller audiences, but audiences nonetheless. These films may use duration, they may employ boredom as an aesthetic tool, but it is in service of an audience. In recent years, I would describe films that employ these techniques as Alexander Sokorov's Mother and Son, Carlos Rigado's Silent Light, Bruno Dumont Heydrich, Jessica Hauser Lords, Pavel Pavlovsky Ida, Dietrich Brueggemann's Stations of the Cross, and Eugene Green's Sapienza, which all use elements of transcendental style. And I guess now I should probably add First Reform. That's sort of a little nutshell. There was a moment in March of 1969. I had one of those road to Damascus moments. I was a film critic for alternative radical LA Free Press. And I went to a critical screening in the morning of Pickpocket. It was finally being released in Los Angeles 10 years after it was made. And it's a short film, only 75 minutes long. But in that 75 minutes, while watching that film, I had 2 things happen to me. And those 2 things sort of defined my life. One was, I had this insight about the bridge of style, that spirituality in cinema is connected by style, not by content. And that film, like all the other arts, that style, whether in a cathedral or in a rock garden, is what leads you to spirituality. And the other insight I had, or awareness, was that I had no intention of being a filmmaker. I did not think it was me. I did not think I had that temperament. In fact, I looked down on filmmakers. I was one of those, film critics that tends to say, we'll tell you when you make a good film. And I was living in a house with 4 students from UCLA who were making a biker film called Naked Angels for Roger Corman. And I thought this was just the crudest, if this is what movie making is, I just, disdained it. But then I saw Pickpocket, and I saw this movie, and there's this guy, he writes in his journal, then he goes out and steals some stuff, comes home, writes some more, goes out, the police come and talk to him, goes home, writes some more, runs into his neighbor, this girl, talks to her, goes then back and writes some more. I said, I could make a film like that. And I did, what was it? I would be 69, so 3 years later I wrote Taxi Driver, which is that film. And 2 years after that screening in March of 1969, I wrote this book. Now, those two paths have been diverted. Taxi Driver led one way, and the book went another way. And I thought they would never meet again, but they did. And it happened when I was giving Pawlowski an award in New York Society of Film Critics for Ida. And he had read my book, and I had liked this film a lot. And we started talking about spirituality in cinema. And afterward, I walked back up to my apartment in New York, and I said to myself, it's time now. It's time to write that script you swore you would never write. It's time to write a spiritual film. And it was an intellectual decision. It was just, you're going to be 70 next year. What do you got to lose? Write it. And the moment that freed me, once I made that intellectual choice, then all kinds of repressed feelings and ideas about filmmaking came into play. And the idea of how to make a film where the camera doesn't move, and how to make a film with a slower pace, and all of that. So for that reason, that film represents a sense of completion. And I've been fond of saying, I hope it's not my last film, but if it is, it's a damn good last film. But now I'm going to make another film. So.
If you haven't seen Ida, that's a film to watch. I keep thinking of the thresholds in that movie. It's perfection. And then I was thinking, characters are writing journals with De Niro's character in Taxi Driver, and then Ethan Hawke's character, Reverend Toller. They're journal writers.
Yeah, well, often Taxi Driver was. Light Sleeper was a journal writer. Yukio Mishima was a journal writer. There's another one in there somewhere. I forget who. But I love journal writers, and I love narration. And here's why. A kind of strategy I stumbled upon, and I find it still works, which is you use voiceover, which is like intravenous feeding, very bland, and you just, it seeps in to the bloodstream, and people don't realize it's going in, and they can't taste it. And it's always a mixture of commonplace. I went to the gas station, and the price had gone up to $3.95. I filled up the car. I think my brother may have cancer. He sent me a letter yesterday. That's narration. Okay. And then you tie that to a journal so that it doubles up, so that you see it and then hear it. Now that's a double. That's a distancing device. And there's a great one in in Country Priest, where in Pickpocket, he said, you see him write, I went into a large bank and sat down. Then you see him go into the large bank. Then you hear him say that. Then you see him do it. Now that's happening 3 times. Now, well, obviously, what's he doing? He's just playing with your sense of time. Yeah. So, okay, so you do that. You have the narration. You have the diary. Then you get into a monocular perspective. You only see what the character sees. If he's not there, you don't see it. It's only his world. So it's just one long eyepiece. So now you're going along in this sort of life. He's going here, he's going there. And you try to do this. You do this for about 45 minutes. And the audiences will start to empathize. They will start to relate. And you can't watch a character for 45 minutes and listen to his thoughts and without making a connection, without, I'm blanking on the word I'm looking for, but without, what's the word when you make a connection to a character?
Oh, when you,
Identify.
Identify.
You start to identify with a character. Okay, then all of a sudden the character starts to swing a little bit, not too much, little by little. And he's starting to veer off the path. And now you're an hour and 10, 15 minutes in, and you're starting to realize that this character who I'm identified with, I don't think is worthy of my identification. He's becoming somebody I wouldn't identify with. But I've now invested an hour and 15 minutes.
How do you get them to re-enlist? How do they re-enlist then in that case?
No, they're there. They're hooked because it's just enough. You know, you're not veering that much. You're just veering a little bit more, and they want to know how is this going to turn out. And so now you have them, and if you can do that, if you can get a viewer to identify with a character they don't think worthy of identification. Yeah. It's like smacking them on the head with a tire iron. You just whack, because they have to now do some work themselves. Yeah. They've got to put this together. If I liked Reverend Toller so much before, what do I think about him now? How do I seal that crack in my head? Because that damn director is not going to seal it for me. And the moment that happens, you're doing the best thing you can in art. And it doesn't matter what the viewer's solution is. It will always be a great solution because it's the viewer's solution. And so all you're trying to do is whack them on the head hard enough so that they come up with an answer. And so there have been a number of interpretations of that film, the ending of that film. Yeah. And I had just taken the position that they're all correct.
Thank you for that. Okay. And that's a beautiful position to take. That's what the beauty of art, really, the interpretive quality of the dialogue, which is great. Before I go further, I want to make an announcement of a 1 degree of separation. Tobias Wolff in This Boy's Life, Robert De Niro played an important part. Yeah. And you directed Robert De Niro.
No, I didn't. Never did.
Oh, you wrote Travis.
Yeah, I wrote a couple of scripts he did.
Yeah,
but I never directed them.
No, it's okay. Thinking about theology now, you know, did you minor in theology or major in theology?
Well, at Calvin, everyone had to minor in philosophy, which was essentially theology. Yeah. I had to take 6 hours of Calvin's Institutes. Okay. So I don't think you have to do it anymore. But it was also a seminary, so it was all geared that if you did the undergraduate program, you were, also queued up to join a seminary if you wished.
Yeah. So, just as an artist, a thinker, creator, and thinking maybe someone like Tarkovsky, and this idea of I know you like narrative, of course, who doesn't? But then in slow cinema or maybe in transcendental style, narrative, it might be like a Western, or it's a kind of storytelling that might press on the iconic imagination, where you have something more fluid and unorthodox. Can you help me think that one through a little bit? Am I onto something?
Well, I mean, just this idea of extending time, demanding that not answering the simple questions for the viewer, demanding that the viewer sort of answer them. The Romanians also do it in that film 432, 4 months, 3 weeks, 2 days. You have these long scenes with the girl and her other girlfriend talking, and they're on either ends of the screen, and there are no edits. Now you are trained as a viewer to be edited. You want to know what's more important. And all of a sudden they're not cutting. And that throws you off. The same thing with planometric composition. Planometric composition is when there's essentially one plane of focus. Think Wes Anderson. And so there is no foreground, there is no background. And so foreground is an editorial comment. If I put something in the foreground, I'm making an editorial comment. If there's nothing in the foreground, I'm not making an editorial comment. In First Reformed, there are no over-the-shoulders. Now, an over-the-shoulder, of course, is a basic tool of filmmaking. The first films, this is why I shot it in a square ratio, the first film didn't have many of them. But then once film went horizontal, they needed to stick something here because the head was here, so they stick a shoulder or an ear or something there. And now we all expect to see over the shoulders. It's the lingua franca of storytelling. And I don't think anybody who watched First Reformed said to their person next to them, "Oh my God, there are no overs." But they knew they weren't getting some kind of guidance that they had learned to expect. And so it's a culmination of all of these withholding techniques. But also there's something deeply intuitive about it. Nobody can really, a lot of people have tried to copy, so you can't, it's very hard to copy. Ozu is very hard to copy, just as Ho Xiaoxian. Now I lost my thought. Yeah,
Maybe you
it'll
can
come
pick
back.
up. Yeah, I'm sure it will. Maybe I grabbed onto something there. So I'm thinking of Dogma 95 and someone like Lars von Trier, who's doing a lot of edits, and then freezes something at the very end. How does that strike you?
Well, that's not, that's a kind of Godardian manipulation for fun and intrigue, but it's not essentially about duration. And the thing about duration is you got to do it. You can't do a little of it. I mean, that's one of the problems with Scorsese's film Silence is he does only some of it, but then he gets scared and he's essentially a San Gennaro organ grinder, that's his personality, and all of a sudden he starts moving the camera. And he starts letting the actors act. Well, you can't let actors act in these kind of films. It's the oldest rule of drama. If they're crying on stage, they're not going to be crying in the stalls. And the moment you let your characters start crying on stage, you're doing the work that you want your audience to do.
Let me shift gears here a little bit, then we'll open it up. So to First Reformed, I think I'll say this one first because it's a little bit of an involved question, but I think when you view it, you'll see this is a faith and justice film. It's a meditation on prayer, and it's a meditation on action in an ecclesial setting. There's a scene, and it doesn't ruin anything, but First Reformed Church was a stop on the Underground Railroad. That's one of it's now a church museum when you see the film, but before it was a real part of something of justice. But then the backdrop is an environmental justice backdrop. Could you speak to that connection? And can the church speak? The donors don't want any part of environmental stuff. And on climate protest day that's all around Chicago, I felt it was kind of a providential moment to maybe ask that question.
Well, an idea starts to come alive when two things not normally connected get close enough for a spark to jump between them. The problem and the metaphor. So if the problem is pathological loneliness and the metaphor is the taxi cab, and all of a sudden, boom, a spark occurs. Well, in this particular case, it's the crisis of the soul, and the crisis of the environment. And we have been talking about Kierkegaard's Dark Night of the Soul, what's it called?
Oh, the stages?
Sickness unto Death. And we've been talking about that as long as we've been human beings. The character in there says we wake up in the middle of the night. But it's always been a hypothetical discussion, because you're going to have that discussion, quo vadis, and then your kids are going to have it, and then their kids are going to have it, and their kids are going to have it. Well, maybe not, maybe that's not so true. Maybe we're the last or the next to the last generation that's actually going to have that discussion. Maybe the idea of climate collapse has made the existential dilemma an immediate one rather than a hypothetical one. Should I exist? Well, it starts to get tied up with will I exist? As a species. And so that was the kind of connection that made.
Thank you. And Reverend Toller, if you push pause on your Netflix account or whatever, Amazon Prime, you see there's 4 books on his nightstand. It's G.K. Chesterton's Heretics, Thomas Merton's Letters, the Bible, the American Standard Version, and The Cloud of Unknowing.
Yeah, there's also something, there's a lot of little Easter eggs in the movie. And when I was doing some lectures at seminaries at Fuller and Calvin and Yale, I asked each of the students if they knew what something was. And the first 2 didn't, but the third one, someone did. On his desk, there's a paperweight. And in the paperweight, there's a woman's hand. And in the woman's hand is a hazelnut.
Oh, yeah.
You know where that's from?
I don't know. Oh, do I know it? Oh.
Yeah. The very first book of meditative contemplation, Julian of Norwich, and she looked at a hazelnut in her hand and until she saw the entire world.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's one of the fun things about making films. You can drop little things in there, and if one person gets them, you're happy.
That's great. That's marvelous. Let's see where we can go from here. I'll do one more, then we'll get ready to open it up here. On first reform, what could it be? So much to think. Ethan Hawke did a good job. So did you let him act, or did you? How does it? You just said there's something about actors start acting.
No. First time I met with him, I said, you know what a recessive performance is? I think so. I said, look, in this film, if you sense that the viewer is interested in what you have to say, lean back. And if they're still interested, just lean back a little further. And don't ever give them anything. And so that was, his performance. But one day, we're doing a scene toward the end where he's talking to his pastor, Cedric Kyles, and all of a sudden he starts to cry.
Yeah.
And Ethan got up after the take and he said, I'm sorry, I know I promised not to do that. We'll go back, we'll do it straight. I said, no, Ethan, I think the beauty of making a rule is that you can break it. And I think you just spotted the moment when to break the rule. And the reason you have to break a rule is otherwise the audience forgot you made it. So if you say, we are never going to move the camera, we are not going to pan, we are not going to tilt, eventually they'll forget that. So I was doing one shot there, and I said to the cinematographer, I said, let's lay some track. He said, well, we don't lay track in this movie. I said, I think this morning, I don't know why, it's just instinctual, I think we should break the rule. One shot, break the rule. It's time to break the rule. And there's one weird shot in the film where there's a lateral dolly, and the character goes out of frame, and then he comes back in, and they walk toward the garage. And I just did it so that so the audience, even if it wasn't consciously, would sense that a rule had been broken, and now all of a sudden the rules were all the same again, never break them again. And that's where instinct comes in. you know, all of your academic articles and all of this book and all that crap. You know, but at some point in your bones, you just say, I think we should move the camera. Don't ask me why.
I get it. Okay, I'm sure there's some thoughts out here. In the, Anthony has a microphone. So Anthony, come on and just, yeah.
I have two brief questions. One, Ozan used his camera, I understand, low to the ground. Do you think he was trying to give a child's vision of reality in doing that? And my second question is, Kieslowski's films, especially Blue, do you think he demonstrates some elements of transcendental style in his filmmaking?
Well, Ozu was just the tatami position. That's essentially the seated position for a Japanese person on a tatami mat. So it's down here instead of here where we would put it. That's really where it comes from. Kieslowski, yeah. You know, he is such, I've never really quite been able to get my head around him. I mean, his films are really very impressive. And I've gone back and looked at them and tried to figure out what was really going on. And I'm just missing something.
I just wondered if you would speak to the two creative roles that you have played, writer versus director. Which do you like more? Which are they creatively different? What are the experiences that you have in each one?
Well, they're very different, of course, because they're different modes of thought. Writing is essentially the tools of storytelling. It's not even writing, it's storytelling. Plot, theme, character, dialogue. Directing is the images as ideas. Now, those are two very different things. And since I was raised in a Protestant church, I was raised to believe that if you had something to say, you used words or music. You didn't use images. We didn't have icons. You don't have any of that garbage. And so I had a rather impoverished visual childhood. And it wasn't until I was in Los Angeles I started realizing that images could be ideas, and that this is an idea. Now, there are words we may use for it. Half-filled plastic water bottle, half-filled, 5 words. But it's not 5 words, it's this. And then if I turn it slightly over, it's another whole other thing. And then if I pull away from it, it's a third thing. These are 3 different ideas. So after you've written a script, you have to sort of almost regard the script as a stumbling block, as a hindrance. How can I take this flaccid limp of a story and make it come alive with visual ideas? And so it's a whole other thought process that goes in. And so when I write, I try not to think of shots. I just write the bones. And then when I start going over as a director, then I start visually imagining things.
Great.
You mentioned that when you started writing Taxi Driver, it was a departure away from transcendental style. And I'm just wondering, at the end of the film, if Scorsese does it in a certain way with that aerial shot, sort of introduce something like transcendental style, although, of course, then it goes on and incorporates it into a narrative, sort of in the way that you're saying Tarkovsky does also in his film. I'm curious as to your take on that, and also if there's anything that you would have done differently that you directed.
Well, I'm very glad I didn't direct it. I wasn't there yet. I couldn't have done the job he did. There is nothing of transcendental style in film. There's a lot of other stuff in there. I mean, in Taxi Driver, but there's no transcendental style. And that one ceiling crane shot is actually the only camera move I put in the script. So that was in the script. That's why I think the silence is so fascinating, because Marty is moving into an area. See, Taxi Driver is really where he's comfortable. Marty's moving into an area where he's less comfortable, which is this aesthetic world of these priests. And you could just see him being torn apart watching the movie. It's like watching a director being drawn and quartered on screen.
Thank you very much for that. I think you spoke with a lot of power and a lot of clarity about the sorts of demands that slow cinema and transcendental cinema make on viewers. Now, I love the films of Bellatar as much as anyone. However, I think that maybe in our current age, in an age where we're so sort of hyper-connected to our technology, particularly through our cell phones, I sort of fear that we're losing not only our sort of capacity to lean forward, as you suggested, and engage with films in a meaningful way, but in a lot of ways we're also losing the theatrical experience of going out to see films. On the other hand, though, I do think that companies like Amazon and Netflix, I mean, of course, Martin Scorsese's The Irishman is about to be released through Netflix. However, on the opposite hand, these streaming platforms are sort of getting us used to half-watching films while we sort of fiddle around with our cell phones. So I suppose my question is, I'm just wondering if I could get your thoughts on the state of the industry and the state of sort of what your thoughts are on streaming. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty big subject and probably a subject for another conference. People say, so I'm not going to answer the question directly. I'm going to answer part of it, which is, in our new hyperkinetic cinema, with, every, what is it now? They say every 20 years, the number of cuts in a film double. So if you go through the history of film, you just start doing the cuts, like Wild Bunch was, the most cuts in the history of film when it came out. Now it looks slow. So now we're all riding in Tony Scott's race car. And they say, well, doesn't it make it harder to do slower cinema? And I said, no, it makes it easier. Because in the past, when you slowed down, people just thought you were not good. But now they know you're doing it intentionally.
That's great. Hearing a lot of male voices over here, and is there, I don't mean to be gender politics, but are there any women who have any questions? Maybe about how Paul Schrader writes women in his films, I don't know, that could be a question. Anybody? That's not a mandatory thing, but okay, any question, that's good. We have time for a couple more.
Thinking about a lot of your films, three in particular that are coming to mind right now, First Reformed, Taxi Driver, and Mishima, they all sort of build towards the main character trying to prove a point to like a public audience, failing and then punishing themselves, and failing at that too. Is there any reason you're drawn towards these sort of stories, do you think?
Well, it's Christianity. It's the pathology of suicidal glory. We're all soaked in the blood. And this notion that I can earn my redemption through my own suffering. And that is a mighty temptation, and it's a sinful one. And, God did that, Jesus did that for us. We're not supposed to earn it. But the idea of earning it is so seductive. You talk about Flannery O'Connor, Hazel Motes, I'm going to earn this. I'm going to put out my eyes, like Samson, I'm going to wrap myself up. And so that's where it comes from. And I knew Taxi Driver was a pathology of suicidal glory, and I wanted to write another one on it. And I realized the really interesting way to do it was go to the other end of the bookcase. Go to the East, go to a homosexual, go to a literary novelist, go to a wealthy, prestigious, respected man, a family man, and show him in the grips of the same pathology. This idea that Bushido I will earn my own transcendence. And that's why it is such a viral pathology. And it's also full of all the Abrahamic religions. It's in Judaism, it's in Islam, it's in jihad, I can do it myself. I don't need you, Lord. No. And so that's all been lingering underneath a number of characters I've written just because it's my background.
Hello, yes, please. Thank you.
In First Reformed, your character, Ethan Hawke's character, reads from Thomas Merton. And I'm wondering if Merton is a particular interest of yours and how you were introduced to Merton.
Well, Merton is the thinking man saint, and I hope someday he does become a saint. And like in Grand Rapids and Calvinism, we had like T.S. Eliot and C.S. Lewis, the thinking men's Christians. So you have Thomas Merton, and he's a very inspirational guy. And Ethan, in fact, has been to Gethsemane, which is the monastery in Kentucky, on a number of occasions. Oh. So that it was just a natural fit. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, speaking of saints, then I'm just looking at your right wrist there. You got a St. George bracelet on your right wrist.
Well, I was in Georgia 2 days ago.
Oh, okay. Oh, Georgia. Oh, I thought it was St. George because I thought it was.
No.
I was about to say, what is a Calvinist doing with a devotional on his wrist? But
No, this is Georgia on the Black Sea.
oh, excellent. Okay, I think we've come to our point. There's one more. Thank you, ma'am. Yeah.
You mentioned the film Nita, the Polish film.
Yeah.
Very beautiful, but it was shot in black and white. I wonder why he did that.
Well, it's a withholding device. The same reason after I talked to him and I walked uptown, I said, I'm going to do it the same way. 1:3:3, square format, black and white. Now, I ran into a delivery requirement that kept me from using black and white, but I was able to use it in the square format. And it's just a way to give less. And subtle way to give less. Another thing Pavel does in that film, he uses the square format, but he composes for the bottom of the frame. So he's actually composing in a rectangular frame and leaving the top empty. Very, very, very cool. And but I should probably answer one question before we quit.
Yeah.
Because somebody always asks it, and somebody asked me about the ending of First Reformed. And
is this a spoiler?
No.
Okay.
Well, I assume the film's been around forever. Why, is this an anti-spoiler community?
I don't. Please continue.
So at the end of the movie, I've been criticized by people, and when I was previewing it, not previewing it, but screening it for people, I would always ask, I ask you the question right here. At the end of the movie, is Reverend Toller alive or dead? Is he alive?
Yes.
Usually, when I would ask that, I'd get a pretty close share of hands, but if there were too many people who thought he was alive and not enough people who thought he was dead, we'd go back in the editing room and make some very subtle changes, and so that it would be the same amount. And I realized to do that because years after Taxi Driver came out, there was a school of kids who started saying that the ending was a fantasy. Now, this wasn't Scorsese or I's idea, but when I first heard it, I said, Marty, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
I said, I don't either. I said, if they want to believe that, good.
Yeah.
And so this time when I came around to it, I said, well, let's build it in for them. Let's bake it into the cake. And so there's one interpretation, which is that grace intervenes. Grace comes crashing down in the person of this girl, and he is rescued from his suicidal pathology and thrown into a moment of carnal ecstasy, just like the ending of We're Dead. And You know, that's a good interpretation. I like it. There's another interpretation, which is that he's having an ecstatic vision. Now here he stands in Gethsemane. He has the cup in front of him. Before he had been told, you're always in Gethsemane, you're always in the garden. And he drinks the cup of Drano. And he falls onto the floor on hands and knees, and he starts disgorging his stomach. And God walks into the room. Now, God hasn't spoken to him for the course of the entire film. But then God walks in and says, Reverend Toller, do you want to know what heaven looks like? I'm going to show you right now. It looks like one long kiss. And that's the last thing he sees.
Wow.
So that's the other interpretation.
Let's all show our appreciation for Paul Schrader.